Hey guys, and welcome to a new video. Today, I wanted to do more of a rant style video where I talk about the whole idea about Splatoon 2.5. It was a pretty big thing in the community for a while. I think it first started after the Salmon Run trailer and continued even after the Direct, even though I think for the most part, the Direct completely dispelled a lot of the issues that the 2.5 crowd was bringing up. But I really wanted to talk about this because we are less than 1 week away. Right now, it seems kind of bad to say that Splatoon 3 is Splatoon 2.5. There's a lot of new things, there's a lot of improved things, and of course, I'll be getting to that. But I also wanted to make it clear that I think Splatoon 2.5 was always kind of a dumb concept. And I wanted to go through all of the reasons that I found that I really dislike and disagree with the Splatoon 2.5 arguments. And I just want to go through the video and explain it to you guys in a way that makes sense before this topic completely falls down because we have Splatoon 3 and there's really no more reason to be comparing it to Splatoon 2. And I think Splatoon 3 is obviously going to be doing a lot more than Splatoon 2 ever did. So let's start with the biggest reason, and I want to tackle this first because it's still technically something that people brought up after the Direct, so I want to get this out of the way first. This is really the linchpin that I think holds the entire argument together. No new modes, they say. There are no new modes coming in Splatoon 3. Okay, let us completely ignore tabletop turf battles, because that is a new game mode, and very inarguably a new game mode. It is something completely new. It is something completely different. But I think it's fair enough to say that it isn't exactly what I think a lot of people who were wanting a new game mode were really asking for. So, what about Salmon Run? The new wave and big run and all of that stuff, that's new things. Some pretty big new things. And we've known that there were going to be changes to Salmon Run for a long time. Sure, they're just updates, but I'm pretty sure the next wave portion of Salmon Run was a pretty big deal. I definitely think you could consider it a new mode. Not to mention the fact that Salmon Run is now open 24/7. But if we really want to go for new modes, then I actually think I should point out Open Anarchy, and there's Anarchy Series, and then there's League Battles, and then there's also X-Rank. Those are new modes. The Open Anarchy and the Anarchy Series are new modes that you play ranked. Sure, they aren't exactly the same thing as new ranked modes, which I'll get into, but Open Anarchy is just flat out a brand new game mode, a way to play ranked without playing ranked. I should say, it's a much less punishing way to play ranked, which is so needed. That was seriously one of my biggest issues with Splatoon 2, because I would love to play with all the different weapons, but it's really hard to play Sniper and rank, because you're always losing rank. I could probably move forward above the S+ I am now, and go on to the higher ranks, probably even X rank, if I just committed myself to playing the NZAP all the time, but I'm not that sort of player. I want to play with chargers and heavy splatlings, and do dumb stuff with like Clash Blaster or Bamboozler, and I can't really do that in the way ranked was in Splatoon 2, but now I could just join open ranked or even do a series, and it'll be a lot easier, it'll be a lot less frustrating, but there's still League and X rank, which are the more hardcore ranks. Essentially, we're getting casual ranked modes in Splatoon 3, and that's huge. Like, I think that shouldn't be ignored just because, admittedly, I don't think everyone knows about these changes, because they're a bit cryptic and also include stuff that's going to happen in an update, since X rank isn't available until later, which, is a bit disappointing, but they always do this, so it's not unexpected. No new ranked modes, and no ranked modes even announced, is strange. I will admit, it is strange. It is something I thought would happen if you've seen my videos. But it's not like the most unexpected thing. At the launch of Splatoon 2, there was only the 3 old ranked modes, and at the launch of Splatoon 1, there was only 1 ranked mode. So adding ranked modes later is very common practice. It's just, I do feel like they should have maybe made it clear that we're getting a new ranked mode later, because without it, yeah, it is a bit of a bummer that there's no confirmation on new ranked modes. There very well could be no new ranked modes, and that'd be admittedly sad. But I don't think that's enough to call the game not a sequel. Just, you don't need to have all new game modes or 1 or 2 extra game modes if the game modes you have are fine. And like Splat Zones and Tower Control and Rainmaker and yes, even Clam Blitz, they're all fine modes that are completely replayable, especially if we're getting new maps, which of course we are. So I just don't think not having a new ranked mode is good enough excuse, especially when we have other new additions in so many other areas. Okay, but let's go to a more general issue. There's no new content coming. Well, this was admittedly a bigger thing before the Direct, but just so that we go over this, the Squid Roll and Surge are huge changes that are going to completely change the way Splatoon is played. It's admittedly small things, but they have a huge impact, especially for certain weapons, like Dynamo and Blasters have so much more movement options because they can Squid Roll and they can Squid Surge. There's new weapons. We already knew of the Tri-Stringer, and I think it was fair to expect at least one more new weapon class, that which the Direct confirmed. There'd also be new kits. This has also been something that we've suspected for a long time, and we're also suspecting that we will get 3 kits, though this isn't confirmed. I mean, this was always going to happen, always have new kits. Some would be based on old kits, and then you'd have the new Tri-Slosher, which is insane kit that I don't understand completely yet, but still, new kits, that's something new, that's more ways to play. Speaking of new kits, are we going to forget the fact that there's new specials and new sub? Just one new sub. And there are returning specials and returning subs that were only really added at the tail end of Splatoon 2 that anyone who didn't play at the end of Splatoon 2 probably don't even know about. There's so much more new stuff to do with specials that are really fun to use and really interesting to use and have interesting counterplay. And again, we knew about this since very early on in Splatoon 2's news cycle, so it's not like we were not expecting new specials. They also took away content. They took away Ink Armor and Stingray, and they should have taken away Tenta Missiles, but we'll ignore that. They took away some of the most annoying parts of Splatoon 2, and I really don't think we should ignore that. They were willing to remove specials and all that sort of stuff for Splatoon 3, but I don't think if it was an update they would be able to do that without getting a lot of backlash, even if removing Ink Armor and removing Stingray is genuinely one of the best ideas they've ever made. Customization! There's a lot more customization, there's a lot of new character customization, and with the Direct we got lockers and a better gearing system. It was very clear from the off that customization was going to be a bit more important in Splatoon 3, and if the apartments were anything to go by, which having some sort of customization that you can spend your money on was something sorely needed in Splatoon 1 and 2. So lockers were definitely an expected system, even if the way they were implemented wasn't. And still, it's pretty huge that we're getting customization stuff. That's always really nice and adds a lot to the game, even if it's admittedly, technically, fluff. Oh, but the single player doesn't seem super good. The single player seems generic and, just boring. Splatoon is a multiplayer series. The single player is just a bonus, a good bonus. Something I like a lot. The single player was always something I felt was overhated. I think a lot of people forget that it's more of a tutorial, and while I think it's fair to criticize it being a bit bland and a bit rote, I think people are more judging the single player on what it could be rather than what it is. What it is just fine, perfectly suitable for what game type it is, and I think what we are getting and what we've gotten is completely justifiable, not to mention the fact that we always get new lore and story, and while it's never been the most expansive thing, it's always been fine. It's always been fun. And I think Splatoon does a pretty good job with its lore. So we're probably going to be getting more of that. That's very expected. And honestly, from the trailers, I think the story mode seems just fine. And I know it can be a bit sad when something is just fine when it could be amazing, but I don't think it's that important that we get a great story mode in Splatoon. Maybe someday, maybe with the teased DLC that's coming out that's very definitely seems like a single player expansion, but I'm happy with what I've seen, and I do look forward to playing the single player, even if it's not that filling of an experience. Okay, well, I've said all of this stuff, but I think there's some other arguments that we can go over, like Splatoon 2 and Splatoon 3 look very similar is something I've seen before, which is weird because they don't. This is kind of a smaller thing, but it's because it's the small things that matter. The UI has improved quite a lot with indications about specials. The Rainmaker is shown in the HUD, the clams are shown in the HUD. It's small things like that that just make the game feel not only more alive, but more useful. The UI improvements are small, but they're all important. Things like being able to see when a team has wiped, seeing when one person has died and where they died, and then even things like the cards and... it's just... the UI has improved so much that I think it already looks quite a bit different just because the UI is better. It was the same sort of thing between Splatoon 1 and Splatoon 2, where Splatoon 2's UI was so much better and more ahead of Splatoon 1, that even just by the UI, I think Splatoon 2 made a huge improvements in its looks. We have more animations, more unique animations. A lot of the animations have been enhanced, admittedly slightly, but there's just a bit more bounce and step in a lot of the things you do, and it's hard to notice. I genuinely know it's hard to notice a lot of these small changes, but they're there, and they make a difference. Splatoon 3's visuals are as close to Splatoon 2's as Splatoon 2's is as close to Splatoon 1's, if you can understand that word salad. Essentially, I don't think Splatoon 3 looks too similar to Splatoon 2. Okay, but let's get to some of the more meta reasons people didn't expect or like that Splatoon 3 was coming. Specifically, Splatoon 2 is already on the Switch! Why didn't they wait for a new console? First of all, I genuinely don't believe we're getting a new Nintendo console for a while. Like, the Direct confirmed 2 years of updates, and that genuinely makes me think 2 years of Switch. I could probably make a full video on why I think that the Switch has a long life ahead of it, even still after 5 years, but seriously, the Switch is fine, guys. 2 years ago when Splatoon 3 was starting being made, I doubt they had any plans for a Switch sequel. And 2 years later, through the entire pandemic, I really doubt Nintendo was thinking about the console even now. Okay, but I feel like we should address some of the hypocrisy here. 'Cause like, sequels being on the same system isn't something new. It's incredibly common, especially for the longer life cycles of consoles, which Switch seems to be a pretty long life cycle. So of course there's gonna be sequels on some of these. Hell, Breath of the Wild is essentially getting a second game here, and it's coming out after Splatoon 3. So, that's already odd, but if you want to say Splatoon 2 being multiplayer makes a difference, did we just completely forget about COD and the fact that it was having yearly releases at some points? Like, I know that's a bit of an old-fashioned way to do it, but the idea that multiplayer games having multiple releases on one console isn't that groundbreaking, and I don't think it's that crazy, especially with what Splatoon is as a series. Splatoon as a series isn't a Fortnite, it is far closer to a COD, and what I mean is that Splatoon really isn't a live service game. You buy for it once, you maybe pay for some of the DLC, and otherwise, there isn't really any microtransactions, and I don't think we're having them added in Splatoon 3. Hopefully, or not having microtransactions in Splatoon 3. Like, the closest thing we got were amiibos, and those have always been a gray area in terms of microtransaction and product and figurine. So Splatoon 2 is a buy once, play forever sort of game, as opposed to Fortnite where you have to buy battle passes. And when you realize this, I think it becomes pretty clear why we need a sequel and not just a Splatoon 2 update. Speaking of which, it could be an update though, right? I mean, why can't it just be an update? Like, why can't this be Splatoon 2, the apartment expansion, where we just get all these new systems added on top of Splatoon 2? Well, first of all, they make a lot of enhancements in Splatoon 3 that I genuinely don't think could have ever fit in Splatoon 2. I don't think the replay system could be added post-launch, at least not very easily. I admit I'm not super technically knowledgeable, but that seems like something you need to have in the system early on, or else it's going to be really hard to add it later. Replay systems seem pretty complicated, and if you don't have a way to hold all that information of what happened during the game on an external server or in the game, then if you don't have that functionality when the game comes out, I don't know how easy it's going to be to re-implement it. Another thing is things like Big Run and Open Anarchy, and improvements to the single player. Like, I think there could definitely be some of these things that would be pretty hefty to try and fit into Splatoon 2. What about the lockers? What about the more detailed customization? Especially the lockers. Like, there is no way that sort of system is available in Splatoon 2. However, maybe, just maybe, they could implement all of those things. You know, replay system isn't as complicated as I think it is. Lockers, there was always physics for props to be placed in lockers. That sort of thing. Maybe all of that was relatively easy to implement. I think there is still value in implementing them all at the same time in one big update, but not a big update, or not in a big DLC, but in a sequel, because these are things that are valuable to a sequel. And finally, I think I need to touch on what makes a sequel a sequel. I need to touch on the thing that I think is the biggest issue with 2.5, because I've been poking a lot of small holes in it so far, but now I want to go on the big one. Why can't we have a Splatoon 3? Why does it seem like everyone talking about Splatoon 2.5 just can't admit that a sequel to Splatoon 2 is something that could happen? This might seem like a weird thing to bring up. All of the people that are talking about Splatoon 2.5, especially after the Direct, are people that seem to not really understand why a sequel would be made at all. A big part of it is just business sense. Splatoon 2 is a buy once, play forever sort of game that doesn't require any of the DLC. That means it's on borrowed time for money. They get as many sales in the first day or week as possible, and then every update, every DLC, they might get some amount of people joining the series. But after 3 and 4 years, convincing people to pay money for Splatoon 2 becomes so much harder, especially if there aren't giant updates coming around every few months. I know this firsthand. I know that there are some people in my life that wouldn't play Splatoon 2 because they were expecting a Splatoon sequel. This was even before Splatoon 3 was announced, and only became even harder once it was announced. And I should really point out, Splatoon 3 was always going to happen. Splatoon 2 was never, ever made to last forever in the same way a Fortnite or a Apex Legends or Destiny 2 is meant to be. It was made to come out, have a few years of life, and then get shafted for another game to take up its legacy. And that's what's happening. And I feel like the people that were really pushing for Splatoon 2.5 were just being impatient, with Splatoon 3 being a guarantee. I think it's kind of weird to say things like, oh, it could have just been an update. Why is it on the next console when we aren't even sure if that exists yet? Why aren't there any new modes? Where are the new modes? And let's ignore those new modes that we're getting. Where's the new content? Ignore all the new content, but where is the new content? What about the single player? Even though it looks exactly the same as all the other single players, why aren't we getting better single player? And I just feel like a lot of this stuff stems from the fact that we didn't get a lot of news for a long time. But this stuff was expected. Everything in the Direct was, in some way or form, somewhat expected. And I feel like Splatoon 2.5 came entirely out of people's heads that Nintendo had zero plans for adding more stuff into the game that wasn't shown already, despite the fact that we hadn't seen ranked mode. We didn't know what the Salmon King was. We barely saw anything of single player. We barely saw anything of the multiplayer. Like, it was very obvious they were keeping things too closer to the release of the game, and considering that the game almost definitely got delayed, like, it's insane that people were so adamant that Splatoon 3 would never have as much content as it needed to be considered a sequel when we were still months and months and months away from launch, when we know Splatoon is a series that likes to keep its cards close to its chest until its release time. And hey, when the Direct happened, we've been getting news almost daily, and it's all been pretty impactful news, and we got a giant demo that people are super excited about, and it's also leaked a bunch of information. And it's like, oh hey, it's that hype that we all knew was going to happen, because it's a new video game in a series we love. I can't help but also give a little bit of blame to Nintendo here, because the game was revealed far too early, like an entire year too early at least, and maybe even should have been held back more than that. I can't help but dislike the way people talked about Splatoon 3 before the Direct, and even somewhat after the Direct, as if it had no stakes, it had no feet to stand on, when we hadn't even seen its feet. Everyone was just so impatient and so ready and willing to turn on a game that they had no real reason to turn on. People got so upset about how little information they had. I feel like people were getting angry that the hype train crashed when they were the ones cutting the brakes. Like, of course the game's gonna not feel as hyped to you. I feel like if you put your expectations over the moon and then won't accept anything below those expectations, no matter how great it is, then you're not helping. You're not helping the argument. You're not helping the discussion. All you're doing is whining that the game isn't as great as you think it could be. And while there is some truth to that, I think people were very immature about their beliefs of a Splatoon 2.5, because when they didn't get the information they wanted, at the time they wanted, instead of calming down and thinking through and realizing that they probably were just waiting for it to be closer to the release date, they said this was it. There was no way Nintendo had anything else up their sleeves. What we saw in those first few trailers was all we're going to get, and the game just wasn't going to have as much content. But now, we're less than a week from launch, and that just isn't true. It's just not, and I genuinely don't know how people are going to argue that it is. Splatoon 3 is a sequel. It seems like it's going to be a very fun, very fleshed out sequel, and I am very excited to try it out. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Splatoon 2.5. I think it was dumb. I think it was bad, and I think it ruined the discussion around Splatoon 3 for a while. And while I understand where it came from, I feel like where it ended up was so blown out of proportions, it's genuinely laughable. Anyways, I've been Dr. Fish, and thanks for watching.